Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere in dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
All right, let's begin. Welcome to the Stoa, everyone. I'm Peter Limberg, the steward of the Stoa. And the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this very moment. And today we're very lucky because we have John Arquilla and David Ronfeldt, who are both RAND analysts at RAND, and author of numerous articles, including a recently released monograph called Whose Story Wins? The Rise of the Noosphere, Noopolitik, and Information Age Statecraft. And that was just released, I think, a month or so ago. And in 1999, this was a follow-up for another monograph they wrote called The Emergence of Noopolitik towards an American Information Strategy. And I geek out about this stuff, as everyone knows. And this one right here actually influenced a white paper I wrote about 2 years ago on mimetic tribes. And then I was happy to see that piece was referenced in their new monograph. So that was pretty cool. And then I invited David's a friend on Facebook, so I invited him out, got connected with John. So here we are. And what we're going to do, we're going to kind of talk about this monograph. We're going to kind of maybe have a conversation for about 15, 20 minutes between John and I. And if you have any questions throughout, you know the drill. If you've been here before, throw them in the chat. I'll call on you, unmute yourself. If you don't want to be on YouTube, indicate you want me to read your question on your behalf. So I think that is everything. I will allow John to unmute himself. Hello, John, again.
Hi, Peter. Hi, everybody.
So I was thinking, maybe the first question is what motivated you and David to write the original monograph you wrote in 1999 and have this follow-up? And then maybe we could come to terms with all the different terms that are there, like noosphere and noopolitik, that people might not be familiar with.
Sure. Well, David and I have been trying to interpret the strategic implications of the information age for the last 30 years. And with regard to your introduction, while I've remained involved with RAND, I've actually been at the United States Naval Postgraduate School for the last 27 years. But my continued involvement with RAND and with David has been one of the great privileges. In fact, I like to say my best years at RAND were since I left. So we've been thinking about this for quite a while. We developed a concept of cyber war, which people probably have heard a fair amount about now. And we paid a great deal of attention to the rise of networks and the way they would operate. We came up with notions of swarms, and not just swarms of missiles and things like that, but also social swarms. Think of the color revolutions, the Arab Spring, the sorts of things that give power to social movements are really all about networking. And so as a kind of culminating piece of that first arc of our research, we decided that military and defense affairs aside, it was important to rethink statecraft more generally. And so it occurred to us that a century ago, long before the World Wide Web or the internet existed, Teilhard de Chardin talked about this globe-girdling realm of the mind that was one day going to come into being, where all would connect with all and how it would change really the way the world operated. And this made a great deal of sense to us. We began to find bits of evidence of movement in this direction. But what we realized at the time is that where traditional notions of force and statecraft, power in general, have a doctrine associated with them, the notion of realpolitik, this is power politics, economic pressure, military threats, deterrence, coercion, all those sorts of things. There's a very well-articulated doctrine for hard power. Little of that doctrine works very well, I hasten to say, but there isn't really a way of thinking or acting or really a set of concepts for the use of softer ideational power. And so that's really what Noopolitik is all about. How would one take this notion of this globe-girdling realm of the mind and turn it into something that could actually inform and guide policy, leave room for prosperity and peace, and make a world less permissive of the kinds of conflicts we've seen not only the last few decades, but really in the 75 years since the end of World War II. On average, the world has had over 30 wars ongoing at any given time. There are about 40 going on today. And while we don't have things like World War II in terms of many tens of millions of lives lost, there are countries in which terrible conflicts are underway, in which the percentage of the populations is far, far greater than suffered in World War II. When you think about the 5 million who died in the Congo, the million in Syria, and of course half of the country's population made refugee, the charnel house of Yemen that exists today, on and on. And so we think there's plenty of room, especially because of the very failed record of traditional realpolitik, that there is room for this new approach. I'll pause there to let you ruminate and ask another question.
So when I first heard the term noosphere, I loved it. I was geeking out about it. I was using it every time, every moment I could. And so that's maybe what gravitated me to reach out to your original book that you released in 1999. So I'm curious, why did you choose that term particularly out of all the other terms out there, collective consciousness? And maybe you can speak on the evolutionary aspect of it, like the geosphere to the biosphere to the noosphere.
Sure. Well, nous, of course, has the Greek roots of the mind, right? And so a realm of the mind would be a noosphere, and we didn't invent that term. Teilhard de Chardin was the one who really began it, and he's the one who saw the evolution of the planet in terms of the geosphere. It began as the hot rock. Life came to it, whether from the comets dropping water on the planet or natural condensation cooling processes. But geosphere went to biosphere, and now at this evolutionary stage, we have the possibility of this realm of the mind, this noosphere. And again, what we noticed was this lack of any notion of how one would operate in terms of statecraft and diplomacy in a world where there was a noosphere. And I hasten to add that we aren't the first people to think, nor was Teilhard, of this idea of the globe-girdling consciousness. Certainly, Emerson's oversoul is an idea very consistent with this, and he's not the only thinker. But I think we have really taken original path here by suggesting that this concept actually implies a new way of interacting with other nations, and especially with the rise of networks. This is, I think, truly the age of networks. This is the information revolution is most conducive to the formation of flat organizational structures of people drawn together by a common goal without necessarily any kind of central control. And as I look at evolution, and I think David does too, we see in the human experience, at least as we know of it historically, empires were the basic units that drove human affairs for millennia until probably around 1500. And in the last 500 years, the nation state began to emerge, and that dominated. It basically has crushed the empires after 500 years of competition. Now, as the empires, if you want to consider the Soviet Union the last of the empires, or if you'd like to consider the United States as the last empire, as the empires have faded away and the nation states seem dominant, the networks have arisen to challenge them, with the Zapatista movement in the 1990s, with campaigns to ban landmines and nuclear testing, and all sorts of other networked activities. And so we see a world now. The world of empires and nations faded away. Now it's a world of nations and networks. And it saddens us to see how much conflict there is between nations and networks. But that goes to a point that we feel is very important to make, which is that this information revolution can be used for good or ill, for light or for dark. And that is something very much a matter in contention right now, Peter.
Mm. And I want to double click on the dark side in a moment. But to come to terms further, could you explain the difference for people who don't know the difference between hard power versus soft power, and then maybe like sharp power and deal power, as you guys coined this one, and how that relates to Noopolitik?
Sure. Hard power is very traditional. Realpolitik, it's about the size of your economy, the amount of, traditionally, the amount of steel production your country had, because that would let you know how much you could make in terms of weaponry, the advance of your technology, again, for usually for weapons making. Power generally measured in that way, economic, military. To some extent, people begin to pay attention to the notion of informational power through diplomacy. Reputation matters. By the way, if you watch the Pew polling on the views of the United States in the world, you know the last few years, the views of the United States have gone down very sharply, and that's even pre-COVID. And so it's troubling to see that development. Soft power is this notion of influence, of how information affects the way people act, believe. And the whole idea there is that we challenge a little bit is it's the notion of soft power seems to be seen as very favorable. If you can use soft power, oh boy, that's way better than hard power. What we've pointed out is there is a reverse of the coin in soft power. It can be used for very, very dark purposes, such as really intervening in democratic electoral processes, as the United States saw in 2016. But frankly, as many liberal societies have seen in recent years with interventions in their systems using propaganda and other tools to try to muddy up the public discourse. And so that's soft power too. And so Noopolitik in our idea of it is really about trying to separate out that darker purpose and moving toward this more common sense of rights, ethics, the appropriate forms of interaction. And again, we see signs of this trying to poke its head up above the surface in things like the 1948 United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights and Against Genocide. We see it in the Helsinki Accord on Human Rights that was reached with the Soviet Union back in 1975. So there are these elements that are trying to come along, but they're still drowned out very much by hard power. Smart power, that's not our term, of course. It's, I think, associated more with Professor Nye at Harvard. That's really about the skillful blending of soft and hard power to gain some form of advantage. We did come up with this notion of deal power because the current American president seems to be quite fixated on the notion of international relations as fundamentally being transactional in nature, and that you can get what you want by sharp dealing. And that's part of this notion of sharp power as well. It implies a certain kind of cleverness in one's blending of hard, soft power, deal power, et cetera. And I think China is to some extent associated with notions of sharp power. So there's all this typology, and we're not really interested in going down that rabbit hole. We think the distinction between hard and soft power is fairly clear. What's not clear is that people need to recognize that soft power, ideational power, can be used for very, very dark purposes. And one of the ideas behind our Noopolitik is to take an ethical stand in statecraft. And we take heart looking at things like Hans Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations to see that he too, near the end of, and he's sort of considered the father, modern father of 20th century power politics. Here's a guy saying, unless there are kind of rules of the game, there are ethical limits beyond which nations will not go, the system simply won't work. And so for Morgenthau, there's this recognition of the need for an ethical foundation, even to power politics. What we're saying is that this isn't simply a foundation piece. This actually should be much more of the space of international interaction should be bound onto this element, and that in fact the hard power, the need for it, will be diminishing over time, and there will be diminishing returns from the use of hard power. Certainly, as the United States has seen over the last 20 years, at a cost of about somewhere between $5 and $7 trillion, tens of thousands of lives lost or shattered, and of course, hundreds of thousands of lives lost and millions shattered by American interventions using hard power over the past few decades. So we think we're on to something better, and that's why we have come back to this subject, why a shorter version of this monograph, or perspective, I guess is what Rand is calling it now. Yeah, it's definitely our perspective. A shorter version of this made the Handbook for Public Diplomacy, Rutledge's new edition of that. And we were very happy to see it widely read on the Social Science Research Network, Peter. I'm looking at a wonderful pictograph here. I don't know whose it is, but thanks. I really like it. Kind of has a yin and yang with some pictographs in it. Is that from Heron?
I think so.
Yeah, very nice.
So a few more questions and we'll pivot to the chat box. The dark aspect of the soft power and all this, the active measures that Russia's doing, the Internet Research Agency, the Internet Troll Farms, or the Chinese discourse power. Could you speak a little bit about how foreign governments are using this for dark means?
Well, clearly we have a situation where all the American intelligence agencies and many others around the world believe that the Russians are using deepfakes and social media to muddy up the political discourse in the United States. The reports I've seen are pretty conclusive about 2016. What people don't generally hear about is how often these techniques are being used in many other countries trying to hold elections, from France to Cote d'Ivoire to other places. And so this is becoming pretty much a norm. It is, a typical use of propaganda style use, but it's incredibly enabled by advanced technology and connectivity. But let me just say that the United States is not above doing this either. At the height of our intervention in Iraq in the late aughts, we paid millions of dollars to a group to create phony articles to put in a newspaper, several newspapers and other media owned by the US government in Iraq, to try to portray an image of the country that simply wasn't true, and stories that were deeply faked, if not deep fakes. So we have to recognize that the guilt for embracing the dark side of soft power is widespread. And it's, again, our hope that the rise of Noopolitik will create a less permissive environment for this by the establishment of sets of common values. And here, one of our central ideas is this notion of finding the issue areas on which there can be general agreement. And of course, the Anti-Genocide Convention, 1948, Declarations of Human Rights. But we also see things like the global commons. The environment would be, of course, a big part of this, something on which people can come to agreement about protecting. Other areas of the commons would be space. Right now, there's an arms race emerging in space in direct violation of the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. So this would be another area where I think the global commons and our attention to it through a neopolitical perspective would be very, very helpful. And there are many other areas. And I want to just say before we go to chat that David and I have, as much as we're, you might say we have a kind of mystical view of the potential for a new kind of statecraft to emerge, much as Teilhard and Vernadsky and Leroy had a century ago. We're also pretty flinty-eyed about how to get there. And so another concept in our study that we developed here and have been working on for a very long time is this idea of guarded openness. It's a deliberately ambivalent sort of formulation that suggests we want to foster as much openness as we possibly can, but we want to remain as guarded as we can also be against the sorts of things like deep fakes and electioneering from the outside in our liberal democratic processes. And you can think about it on a spectrum, right? Where's the People's Republic of China today? Incredibly guarded with some openness that's allowed them to enjoy some economic prosperity, but basically they've tended to control social unrest. The United States has defaulted a lot more toward openness, and frankly, I don't think we're guarded in the right ways. We're guarding against the wrong sorts of things. And then the European Union, probably a nice blend of guardedness and openness. The global data protection regime they established there, I think, is an excellent example of both fostering openness while at the same time remaining substantially guarded. So hold on to that thought, the global commons, guarded openness. For us at a policy level, you know, we're defense analysts, and another thing that we thought was very, very important was that nations, especially in a world where networks are rising in importance and we are forming alliances very often with non-state networked actors, NGOs, and et cetera, it's important for a nation to know its own information posture. We know, and all the people we work with know exactly our military posture, you know, how many missiles we have, how many ballistic missile submarines are at sea at any given moment, all those sorts, and we know that we're spending $2 billion a day on the military. What do we know about our information posture? What is not only the conduits that we have, the Voice of America and other things, but what's the content we're putting out there? And is it consistent with our actions? An information posture needs to ask and answer questions of that sort. So I know you probably want to go to chat, so I'll pass this back to you, Peter.
Cool. And my last question was going to be about the spiritual side with Desjardins, Omega Point, but Peter Jones has that embedded in his question. So I will tag Peter in if you can ask your question.
Go ahead, Peter.
Oh, okay, thanks. I was curious about perhaps a spectrum of the noosphere from a concept of creating a global consciousness, which might trend towards a technological view. That is, the internet eventually merging into something like maybe not a singularity. It's one idea, but a global consciousness and inter-awareness that exceeds nation states. But on the other end of the spectrum, the original Chardin construct was a really mystical idea, and there might be a spectrum of, you know, his idea was really that there would be an evolution in human spirit that had a telos, that had a directionality towards you know, a unity of human spirit. These might not actually come together in the same way, and actually are, you know, the power games between nation states, hard and soft, may be part of the conflict that actually keeps us from achieving the latter, you know, a spiritual orientation to that unity.
You know, I think it's a point exceptionally well taken, and Teilhard, I think, had it right. You know, that is our telos, that omega point where we do have this global consciousness. He didn't know about the net and the World Wide Web, but he knew that one day all would be connected. And I think if you look at Wired and other organs of communications in the information age, you see they have very much a noospheric perspective. We know Kevin Kelly for a long time, and who was, you know, sort of one of the founding spirits at Wired. He very much is of this mind as well. And we think that especially when you consider, and this is one of the reasons we emphasize notions of the cooperating on the global commons, we're at a point where the future of the planet is at stake, and humanity needs to rise above itself. Or, you know, David and I spent most of our lives thinking about issues of war and peace and security. And I have to say, the system that we have doesn't work very well. There's too much war, it's too destructive. And the idea of going to war over differing God concepts or economic systems seems increasingly absurd. And I think we now have the technology that will allow for a discourse that makes clear the bankruptcy of these older concepts. And it's one of the reasons that for all the different ideas that we've contributed to the defense world, this view of Noopolitik, something that will be a real operating doctrine for the Noosphere, I think is more important than any other work that we've done.
Thank you. If I might add, the other kind of proposal I had in the chat was that if that was a spectrum, another spectrum that might conflict with it, but also align, would be a political spectrum, and it wouldn't be left-right to me. It would be the different gradations of from local to global, including a nationalism, which is a type of somewhere in the middle, and it isn't always bad. You know, John Ralston Sauls had promoted a kind of positive view of nationalism, which we actually see in Canada, which is a movement away from globalization, but is not necessarily away from, you know, global participation, global consciousness. And so I'm starting to imagine from your concept that we could start to reposition the different, you know, and not to have a Manichaean view of nationalism versus globalism, which are both pretty much hard-edged realpolitik approaches.
I think that's a very wise point. The nation state is not going gentle into that good night. And so it has to be brought into this process. And I think you're absolutely right about countries like Canada, like Sweden, and some others that really are understanding that there is the possibility of a harmonious evolution of nations and networks. And that, of course, is counterpoise to those who would use the new technology to reassert forms of sovereignty. So, for example, the social credit system in China is an extremely nationalist view where now you can get a negative score on your social credit in China if a camera picks you up jaywalking on a street in Wuhan. And so it's almost Orwellian, and it's now, as of this year, it's mandatory for everybody. And so I see Alex Warren has asked a question about, is authoritarianism winning? And I'd say it may not be winning, but it's certainly having its innings. And you know, China has, I was just talking about their social credit system, which is clearly authoritarian, or if we wanted to get into definitions, closer to a totalitarian sort of initiative. But Hong Kong looks pretty restive. I think Xinjiang is a problem for them. It's really an open question as to how long China can continue to enjoy the economic and political benefits of the information revolution without suffering the social consequences. And so, yeah, authoritarianism is going to be around, and certainly in our view, I think I'm speaking for David here, we find it far less well attuned to the potentialities of the information age, to the noosphere, to Noopolitik, and that eventually, just as nation states triumphed over empires, I think this more interconnected network-like view, even in a world in which nation states persist, will much, much more come to the fore. But I think we're in for it. Even when our colleague Frank Fukuyama wrote The End of History over 30 years ago, which said that free markets and democracy are going to win out over everything, even he said that's going to take centuries. It will take some indeterminate period. But I think the noosphere concept gives us a way of seeking that telos that Peter was mentioning, that end that we seek, that certainly will work better. And as this global consciousness emerges, the true bankruptcy of the old system of power politics, which has given us perpetual wars, a perpetual state of war in the world that simply drains us. And again, when you look at the causes of these conflicts, all of them are for things that really bear so little on what the human purpose is in the world, the way our economies are structured or how we worship. These simply have to stop being causes of wars. And we think that this notion of the globe girdling realm of the mind will get us to an omega point one day where people will see the bankruptcy of the old system. I'm ready for another question, Peter.
SG, you had a few questions. If you can unmute yourself and ask them.
Hey, John and David. So I'm completely new to your work. This is my first introduction to it, but the whole topic fascinates me. So I just spammed a bunch of questions in the chat, and maybe I'll just try to ask which ones are the most interesting. My exploration of topics of alternatives to hierarchical sort of power systems has led me towards the concept of panarchy as a political philosophy. And I'm wondering if you guys can just chat a bit about that and how you've seen it apply.
Yeah, we have used that term, and our use of it is, if I can put it very briefly, is as of systems that operate and pursue a common goal without central control. And so we have spent a lot of time thinking about networks and what makes for a healthy network. And at the very top of that list of things that matter for networks is their narrative. What are they about? If you want to have this pursuit of a common goal without necessarily a central control, you must have a story. And that's part of our monograph here about it's whose story wins, which story will really predominate over a competing story. A story about the world that doesn't change and in which traditional power is still the sine qua non of statecraft, or is it a story about being able to seek something broader, something brighter that can perhaps save the planet from environmental catastrophe, or keep us from having decades worth of space garbage circling and ruining orbital planes because we've taken war into space. We think that narrative notion is incredibly important. There needs to be a social sense that emerges in these networks that certainly the nation has been a focus of loyalty for centuries now. What if the focus of loyalty is now a social one to those like-minded in pursuit of something like, an anti-landmine campaign or an anti-war campaign more generally, or an environmental group? Identities you can have a number of identities. I haven't stopped being a bombs and bullets guy, even though I'm hoping to seek that telos as well, and I care deeply about environmental and other related issues. So I think this notion of panarchy can also look inward as well, because many of us have quite a few different dimensions to ourselves. The other elements that make networks strong or weak have to do with their topologies. And we feel that the greater the interconnectivity of all with all, the greater the potential strength. I think Professor Metcalfe's law makes this point very well when he says the power of a network is the square of the number of interconnected nodes. And I think that very well explains how quickly the color revolution spun up and had so much effect, why the Arab Spring burst on the scene the way it did. And certainly it explains things like the social revolutions of 1848 as well. They didn't have an internet, but they had telegraph, and there was a lot of coordinating among European cities on the basis of that connectivity. So topology of a network matters a great deal. As far as the technology is concerned, I think the kind of connectivity we have today really primes us for making this leap to the next stage in human intellectual evolution, and hopefully social evolution as well. I know David has wonderful works on this, and we can make sure you have links to his studies of how we humans have evolved from tribes to institutions to markets to networked societies. And I think it's an exceptionally profound work that I think you'd enjoy very much. It'll give you a good sense of how to think about this movement into a networked age.
I have a bit of a follow-up, if Peter, if you'll allow me. When I think about, anyone can create a narrative now, and anyone can sort of accumulate brain power towards a cause, a compelling story. I see it as a very asymmetric warfare type of power, where the individual can compete with more traditional states. It leads me to wonder, from a moral perspective, is asymmetric warfare in and of itself a desirable thing? So yeah, if you could share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, personally, I think all warfare strives to be asymmetric. You don't want simply to go straight at the opponent. All good strategy. Remember what Sun Tzu said: when your opponent is strong in the east, strike in the west. Do something, break the symmetry of the situation. And now, as you so rightly pointed out, we're seeing tremendous asymmetries in terms of the barriers to entry for having influence have dropped substantially thanks to this technology. And to my mind, it's a wonderful thing. And, you know, this isn't simply a story about the conduits. Everyone has the conduit, but who has the content that catches on, right? Just about every person in the world has a website, but how many of them get many clicks, right? There's a handful that dominate the discourse, a relative handful that dominate the discourse space. So the content, that narrative, who's got the right story, and what David and I have been trying to point out is the terrible shortcomings of the traditional story about force and statecraft and what is needed, and the great potential of the system that we're talking about here, which is much more driven by norms and values and common purpose. And, you know, in most of human history, power was hoarded. The world we're looking at is one in which information and power are shared. Something else I would just say, and we've been writing about this for almost 30 years as well, is we move into an age when what people consider solid, hard power is actually softening itself. It's becoming less influential. And the context, the narrative, the informational dimension has been hardening and having greater influence. And I think that's a trend that will continue as well. Next.
All right. Rain, you're up next.
Hey, John, thanks for being here and thanks for your seminal contributions. I want to ask your thoughts basically on the Game B post-Rivalry infinite game space and just your thoughts, but to contextualize it, I've listened to a lot of Daniel Schmachtenberger's work, and there's certain thinkers like Daniel that have sort of taken a big step back and seen that, have the hypothesis that all forms of competitive game theory combined with the exponential growth of technology and the weaponization of technology is sort of a formula for disaster no matter what. So maybe this is a stretch to ask someone who's kind of an expert as yourself in statecraft, but do you think there's a place for post-rivalry? Do you think it's possible? Do you think it's necessary? And if you believe there's some kind of hybrid relationship between local rivalrous situation with global cooperative situations, I'd be curious to hear about that.
Yeah, I love this question, and I don't know if any of my graduate students are still here participating, but we go year round. I'm at a military school, and one of the things I've had them reading this quarter is Robert Axelrod's Evolution of Cooperation. And what I love about it is he takes a game theory construct, the prisoner's dilemma, where, you know, right, two prisoners in different rooms, and everyone who's seen Law and Order knows that you separate them and you say whoever squeals first gets the better deal. And so in game theoretic terms, the dominant strategy is always to rat on the other guy. What Axelrod did is he said, what if prisoner's dilemma wasn't single play, but it went out for some indefinite period? Could cooperation evolve under that circumstance, even in this dire situation? And he ran a couple of computer tournaments on this. And each time, the NICE program that never ratted on the other guy first did the best, and did that in 2 expert tournaments. And then he played an early version of what we would today call the infinite game, which was evolutionary in nature, that went out 20,000, 30,000 iterations of the game, and pointed out how even a small cluster of cooperative regimes will gain more and more space over time against the more conflictually oriented programs. And it is most fascinating. When did he write that? Like 35, 36 years ago. But I think Bob Axelrod was onto something. As long as the window of the future remains indefinite, I think there is, and the telos is not something we're going to try to reach in 10 years. But if we think in terms of a longer timeline, my bet is on Noopolitik as having a much longer lifespan than realpolitik.
Great question. Kyle, you're up next.
Cheers. Thanks for a lovely talk so far. I've been thinking a lot about identity inside of Noopolitik, and you already alluded to it a bit earlier. And I guess as I observe networks, and to kind of allude to Peter's work, we've seen the effects of networks on this enhancing of mimetic and tribal identity, right? And as well as people being able to find each other, amplify voices, etc. So how does identity work in that, alluding to what you said earlier about kind of the decline of nationalism, and I'm thinking of John Robb's work here, where he also has kind of alluded to this declining nationalism and declining these sorts of things. So what is the role of identity inside these politics, and how does it manifest itself? Does it become even more, do we have to go through a period of even stronger identity politics before we integrate and move past that? Or is it just, how do you see that playing out?
I try to grapple with it by accepting the idea that I'm multidimensional. I can be an environmentalist and a defense guy who's, given an oath to my country. I can still have my country as a focus of loyalty, but be interested in these other things as well. And I think in particular, as we look at these broader narratives of the networks, they create what Benedict Anderson called the imagined community. And I'm really excited about that because nation building is a very fraught business, right? It's especially in those cases where the United States has over the past few decades tried to reroute the currents of culture and history with armed force to do nation building. And it seems to me that it is far more productive to understand the imagined community. Who do the Afghans think they are? I mean, they always had an identity. It was very light at the national level, but they were the people of the mountains. They were the people who were the most independent in the world. And there weren't xenophobes. There were always an entrepot and a crossroads of trade. They're a genetic mix of many different peoples. They're among the most multidimensional creatures in the world. I know that probably goes against a lot of what people have heard about Afghanistan these past few decades, but they're a most remarkable people. And we have to embrace the imagined community there rather than try to do what we have done. So my hope is that we will see nations and networks coexisting in a way that will eventually tend more to favor this idea of the aspects of one's identity that look more broadly. Nationalism has not gone away, and in the face of this emerging networked world, the reaction of some has been to try to double down on nationalism. Certainly the notion of America first is an attempt to do that, where we're not out here for the global benefit. But guess what? If we don't have that global view, even what we have at home isn't going to last. The planet's going to go to pieces environmentally. There are so many, even issues like transnational crime and terror will never be dealt with. All the things that matter require more to be dealt with than single nations, even very powerful nations can deal with. So I like the idea of identity as having different facets. At one point, David and I used the Roman god Janus to depict the spirit of networks. If you'll remember, Janus is the two-faced god, the older one looking back, the younger one looking forward. And I think maybe Janus is the right identity for this time. Arthur Koestler wrote a wonderful book about this, simply entitled Janus, in which he said that there is this dual nature that seeks to connect, but at the same time realizes the importance of assertion of the self. And he thought that social evolution was going to play out with this Janus-like phenomenon in play. So that's a great question about identity. No, thank you.
Cool. Albert Kim, you're up next.
Okay, awesome. So I'm gonna work my way up here.
Great background, Albert.
Thanks so much. Very appropriate, right? I'm trying to be like you. My question was, could it be the lack of a coherent information posture by the U.S. Is due to its widespread domestic and international destabilization efforts? I found it very curious. I was reading through your white paper, and I mean, like, there was this. I thought maybe you're just buttering the defense department up, but like, like
they don't think that.
Yeah, because I mean, like, the U.S. has been pumping out disinfo, misinfo, interfering in domestic and international affairs for a long time. So could it actually be that is our lack of a coherent information posture is because we have our tentacles all over the place? And if this is true, I mean, this would support your stance that the nation state is not the right level at which Noopolitik can be affected. So I was wondering, like, what new forms of non-state organization do you see arising that could best implement Noopolitik? And also, as an extra, could you maybe speak on how the discrete realms, the geosphere, biosphere, noosphere, can be integrated? Because I believe, like, the way out for humanity is, like, to build this technium, to build this holos, to build the noosphere, and then integrate everything into a single system. So I was wondering maybe if you would speak on that.
Absolutely. Wow, I hope we have about 2 more hours here. Look, I think you're absolutely right about the problems with the American information posture. The biggest problem is that our actions have not been consistent with our declaratory policies. And I think this has hurt us tremendously. And when you look at the Pew Center's views on what's happened to favorability ratings of the United States in recent years, this bears out the point. The military interventions, and frankly, we have pushed for one side or another to win in elections in different places as well. Maybe not using deep fakes like the Russians do, but it is very hard for us to be the progenitor of the Noosphere and of Noopolitik when we ourselves are betraying so many of its core values. I need to put a commercial in here at the moment, since I'm a government employee, and say that the views expressed are mine alone. That do not reflect official government policy. Let me move on to your point about integrating geosphere, biosphere, noosphere. I think this is a central challenge of our time. Look, if the noosphere does not spread and thrive, we are not going to deal with the most urgent threat to the biosphere, life itself. And we're going to end up a barren rock like Mars, right? We know that sometime in the past Mars had rivers that ran and a better atmosphere, and some people say it even had a better magnetic field back then. So all these things are tied together. There is, and I don't want to sound like a 19th century transcendentalist here, but in fact, one of the pieces we wrote, though, years ago was entitled Transcendental Destination. So you can Google that. But we see all these things as connected with each other. And I don't see the competitive system of nation states as one that's going to allow that integration to occur. And in fact, will create a degradation. And I don't know if there are any political scientists in our Zoom group today, but what is the basic assumption of power politics? That the international system is anarchic. Wow, that's a recipe for absolute disaster, particularly in the kind of technological age in which we live after a couple of centuries worth of the detritus of industrialization. So we're in very, very big trouble here, and the social and political structures by which we live are inimical to the interests of ourselves, for life on the planet, and really to the geosphere itself. And I can't emphasize enough that I think the red light is absolutely flashing. But thank you for your wonderful and wide-ranging thoughts and that beautiful background there. I envy it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. Thank you.
Cool. So we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Dan Feldman, you're up next.
Okay.
Hi, Dan.
Hello, John. Thank you very much for coming to the STOA today. My question, I'm just going to run this off the top of my head. My question was, and I think you just answered it because you were kind of talking about this transcendental alignment in this non-competitive world. I was basically going to ask whether, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the works of Michel Bauwens and others in the common-centric P2P cosmolocal world. And
David's more familiar with them, but he's tutored me a little bit.
Okay. Well, I guess my question is, look, does the noosphere require as a prerequisite the development of this commons from the local level to the cosmological level in order to operate? That essentially right now we have a bipolar world of the market and the state, and essentially we need to reintroduce our ancient commons back into the system,
Yeah.
even with some indigenous mindset, let's say, to achieve, I believe, what you've been communicating in most of your responses and your introduction.
Yeah,
I'm wondering if I've
I
got
think
that.
you're absolutely right about that. And the real question is, does the noosphere have a chance to really get traction and to become the principal means of our thinking about the world? And will Noopolitik become in the way in which society functions going forward? And rather than think in terms of requiring prerequisite conditions, I tend to think of it's like the universe. It all started out dark, and then there are points of light, and we're those points of light, and our job is to expand and connect them up and to cluster them. And I think the notion of the noosphere helps that kind of clustering. We're talking in cosmological terms. I hope I can use this metaphor about the universe. But I think the point is that the overall environment is probably hostile to the development, the full development of the noosphere and Noopolitik, and that it is our job to build and gain traction where we can. And eventually we will reach an inflection point at which this level of consciousness, this realm of the mind that Teilhard and Leroy and Vernadsky talked about, we're going to have this winning combination and would indeed take us beyond. Now, Vernadsky thought this would require a cataclysm first. And I used to think maybe he wasn't quite right about that. But the closer we get to environmental catastrophe, the closer we get to, I think the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists has the nuclear hand closer to midnight than it's ever been before. I hate to think that it's going to take cataclysm to get us to that inflection point. And it is and I think David's belief as well, that we see some signs of progress. We see a yearning among many peoples for movement in this direction. And so I say, let's continue to create points of light in the firmament and make sure that the universe isn't made up 98% of dark matter, at least not the social universe. That's the hope. And that said, that's my belief. I don't know that it's the right answer. And if I'm wrong about this, then Vernadsky will be right and there will be cataclysm. Those, I think, are the stakes we face today.
Thank you.
Seems like a good place to leave off.
Not exactly Mr. Sunshine.
John, do you have any final comments for us today?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone at the STOA for making this event possible. I want to thank my colleague David, who I do not thank enough for 30 years plus of certainly expanding the brain of an old bombs and bullets guy into something and someone very, very different. And I want especially to thank those who've raised questions today that suggest to me, and I hope to David as well, that there is a sense among thoughtful people that we need a major shift in direction. And I hope that the ideas that we've put forward will be held in your minds as a viable option to a system that today, a system of force and statecraft that clearly is not working and clearly is leading toward global disaster. And so with that in mind, I urge us all to keep clustering, keep making more light in a universe of dark matter. We are, and ideas are, I think, the last best hope. Teilhard was very much an optimist, and I'm a great admirer of his. And when I reflect on it, even the hardest of hard power advocates like Hans Morgenthau said ideas, values, norms, ethics, there is something else without which no system of power politics or any kind of politics will ultimately work. And so even if the wise people who employ and practice the business of realpolitik realize this, then I think there's hope for all. So again, thank you all. This has been really a wonderful hour together, and appreciate what you do and the fact that you are creating a virtual STOA. Would that we had more of these in the virtual world, the physical world. And that I'm a big fan of Stoicism, particularly as it emerged in Rome, and which is an ironic thing for a great empire to have some of the most thoughtful Stoics who came along. We teach Stoicism. We have a course on that for our students. I just want you to know here, military officers, it is one of the most popular courses on our campus.
Oh, wow, cool.
I salute you all. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, John. And David, take you in for some comments as well.
Just quickly, sorry about my voice. I put some comments in the chat stream about where to locate the writings that John referred to. Just quickly, Michael Bazar's work does overlap with ours, but he's more taken with the concept of the infosphere. Niall Ferguson's work is about two forms, hierarchies and networks. My work is about four forms, tribes, institutions, markets, networks. And we do draw on the writings of both Ostrom, I forget her first name,
Eleanor.
And Michelle Bowens, particularly in the chapter on the global commons. Anyway, John, good work, John.
Thank you, David. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see everybody. Thank you, Peter. I really appreciate it. Your article about mimetic tribes.
Thank you for that.
Onward.
Thank you. And I'll make an announcement in a moment. But again, gentlemen, thank you so much. Would love to have you come back for the STOA for another collaboration. And upcoming events, John Robb has, the military analyst John Robb, he has a Sensemaker residence series here at the STOA. He was greatly influenced by David's tribes, institutions, market networks theory. And he talks about that often in his session. So if you want to check that out, you can go at 10 a.m. Eastern time here at the STOA. And tomorrow we have Benita Roy, Nora Bateson, and Rhea Beck having a three-way emergent conversation at 12:30 p.m. Eastern time on praxis to collective wisdom, presence, warm data, and insight. It's gonna be very, very awesome. It's gonna be a full house. So you can RSVP to that on the website. And if you like these conversations that we're having at the STOA, this digital STOA that's emerging, you can support us here on our Patreon. All our events are for free, and we'd like to continue to offer all of this during this difficult time we are all facing. That being said, again, thank you, David and John, and thank you everyone for coming out today.
Great.